Morning, my granddaughter grabbed my sleeve at the airport and said, "Grandpa, don't go back to the house. Uncle Darren is there, and he's doing something to your papers." I almost laughed. She was 7 years old. She had maple syrup on her sleeve from breakfast and a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. I almost laughed. I didn't. I've been around long enough to know that children don't make up things that specific. They make up dragons and talking dogs and reasons why they can't eat their vegetables. They don't make up uncles going through papers. Let me back up a little, because this story doesn't make sense without the context. And the context is the kind of thing that takes 63 years to build. My name is Roland. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working in commercial insurance in Cincinnati, Ohio, the last 12 of them as a regional director. My wife Carolyn passed away 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. The kind that moves fast and doesn't give you time to say everything you needed to say. We had 2 children. My son Darren is 38. My daughter Becca is 35. She's the one whose little girl grabbed my sleeve that morning. After Carolyn died, I made a decision that I thought was generous. I sold the house we'd lived in for 27 years, the one on Fielding Drive with the big oak out front, and I bought a smaller place out in Loveland, about 20 miles east of the city. Quieter. A little land, a detached garage I converted into a workshop. I do woodworking now. Nothing serious, mostly furniture for the grandkids and birdhouses I donate to the church raffle. It keeps my hands busy. The proceeds from Fielding Drive, combined with my retirement savings and Carolyn's life insurance, left me in a position I never took for granted. I wasn't wealthy in the way people think of wealthy, but I was secure. The kind of secure that takes a lifetime of brown bag lunches and no new cars until the old one dies completely. Darren had always been the son who needed a little more runway. That's how Carolyn used to put it, and I always thought that was a kinder way of saying what I sometimes thought in the harder moments, that he never quite got there on his own. He had a good heart, I believed that then, and I believe it now, but he made choices. The business that didn't work out, then the second one that didn't either. The ex-wife, the apartment he couldn't afford, the loans that came back to me one way or another. I'd helped him over the years, never kept a running total, because that's not how family works. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Maybe I should have. About 18 months after Carolyn passed, Darren came to me with something new. A storage facility development deal on the west side of Cincinnati. He had a partner, a man named Curtis, who wore very good shoes and talked about projected ROI the way some men talk about football. The numbers looked reasonable on paper. Darren needed a cosigner on a bridge loan and a capital injection of around $90,000 to hit the threshold for the primary lender. I said no, the first time. I said yes the second time, 3 weeks later, when Darren brought Curtis back and they showed me revised projections, and Darren looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was 12 and wanted something badly enough that it hurt to watch. $90,000, co-signed on a note for $420,000 more. I told myself Carolyn would have done the same thing. The project stalled 6 months in. Curtis disappeared. I mean that almost literally. 1 week he was answering emails, the next, the number was disconnected and the project email bounced back. Darren said he was handling it. Darren said the attorneys were involved. Darren said a lot of things over about 4 months. And during those 4 months I started to notice other things. Small things at first. A manila folder on my kitchen counter that I didn't remember leaving there. My filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, which I kept unlocked because I'd never thought I needed to lock it in my own home, sitting at a slightly different angle than usual. Which sounds like the kind of thing a paranoid old man notices, except that I'm particular about that room and I know where things are. Then my financial advisor, a woman named Sue Pemberton, who I'd worked with for 11 years, called me in March to confirm a change of address request she'd received on my account. I hadn't submitted any change of address request she'd received on my account. I hadn't submitted any change of address request. Sue caught it before anything moved, but the request had my signature on it. Or something close enough to my signature that it had gotten through the first filter. I didn't tell Darren about that call. I told Sue to flag anything unusual and call me directly, on my cell, before acting on any instruction that came in by mail or email. Then I went back to looking at that filing cabinet. I want to be honest about what the next few weeks felt like, because I think people imagine that when you start to suspect your own child of something like this, it's dramatic. It isn't. It's mostly just quiet and gray. I'd be out in the workshop, sanding a chair leg, and I'd stop and just stand there with the sandpaper in my hand, not thinking anything specific, just sitting in this low-grade dread that I couldn't quite name yet. Darren came around often that spring, more than usual. He'd always had a key to my place. I'd given it to both kids years ago for emergencies, and he'd started letting himself in when I wasn't home, leaving notes on the counter about stopping by. I didn't think much of it at first. He said he was using my truck sometimes when his car was in the shop, which happened more than I'd have expected. It was a Sunday in April when Becca brought her family up for the day. She and her husband Ted live in Dayton, about an hour away. They have 2 kids. The older one, a boy, is 10, and then there's Iris, 7 years old, with her grandmother's brown eyes and an absolute inability to keep a secret, which I have always considered one of her finest qualities. They arrived mid-morning. We had lunch, and then Ted took the boy out to throw a baseball around in the back. Becca was helping me in the kitchen, and Iris had been playing in the living room with the small wooden horse I'd made her the previous Christmas. At some point, Iris wandered into the spare bedroom. I didn't think anything of it. She liked to look at the old photographs on the shelf in there, pictures of Carolyn from when the kids were small. I could hear her in there, quiet, the way kids get when they're looking at something that holds them. About 10 minutes later, she came out. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as careful, like she was deciding whether to say something. "What is it, Bug?" I said. She looked at her mother, then back at me. "Uncle Darren was in there," she said, "last time we came." Becca looked up from the cutting board. I kept my voice even. "You saw Uncle Darren in there?" "He didn't see me," Iris said. She had the stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest now, both arms around it. "I was behind the chair. He was taking pictures of your papers with his phone. The papers in the drawer." I looked at Becca. The color had gone out of her face. "Iris," Becca said carefully, "are you sure that's what you saw?" "I was behind the chair," Iris said again, as if that was the part that mattered most. "He didn't see me." I crouched down to her level. I am not a man who cries easily. I come from a generation that was raised to see that as a kind of indulgence. But I felt something move through my chest in that moment that I'm not sure I have the right word for. Grief and rage and something else. Something almost like relief. The terrible relief of a thing you'd suspected finally having a shape. "You did right telling me," I said. "You did exactly right. I didn't call Darren that night. I needed to think. What I did instead was drive to an office supply store the next morning and buy a small personal safe. The kind that bolts to the floor of a closet and takes a combination. I moved the most critical documents into it. The original deed to the Loveland property, my will, the account statements, the partnership documents from the bridge loan. Then I called my attorney, a man named Bill who I'd used for estate planning after Carolyn passed. I told him I needed to meet, and I needed it to be soon, and I didn't want to discuss it on the phone. I also called my daughter. That conversation was hard. Becca is loyal the way her mother was loyal, which means she doesn't want to believe bad things about people she loves, and she spent the first 10 minutes finding reasons that Iris might have misunderstood what she saw. I let her work through it. Then I told her about the change of address request on my financial account. I told her about the filing cabinet. I told her that I needed her to help me think clearly, and that I couldn't do this alone. She went quiet for a long time. "Dad," she said, "how long have you been sitting with this by yourself?" "A while," I said. "You should have called me." "I know." There was another silence. Then, "What do you need?" I told her I needed her to act normal if Darren called. I told her I needed a little time. My meeting with Bill happened 2 days later. I brought everything I had, the loan documents, the signature discrepancy that Sue had flagged, my own notes about the filing cabinet, and Darren's increased presence at the house. Bill is a careful man. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he sat back and folded his hands on his desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Roland," he said, "you understand that if someone uses your signature without authorization on a financial document, that's fraud." "I know what it is," I said. "Do you want to go to the police?" I told him I didn't know yet. I told him I wanted to understand the full scope of what had happened before I made any decisions I couldn't take back. What came out over the following 3 weeks, with Bill's help and the help of a forensic accountant he brought in, was worse than I had expected, and somehow also exactly what I'd feared. which is a combination that makes you feel both vindicated and hollow at the same time. The bridge loan I'd co-signed. There were two versions of it. The one I'd signed had specific collateral provisions and a personal liability cap. The one on file with the lender had different terms. My liability was uncapped, and there was a clause I'd never seen or agreed to that allowed the lender to pursue my primary residence as collateral in the event of default. Someone had substituted pages after I'd signed. The signature was genuine. The document around it was not. The storage development was in default, had been for 4 months. The lender, a private equity group out of Columbus, had not yet moved to collect, but Bill said that could change any time. If they did, under the fraudulent terms of the document on file, they could come for my house in Loveland. There was more. A beneficiary change had been attempted on one of my annuity accounts, an account I'd set up with Carolyn, with both kids listed equally. Someone had submitted paperwork to shift Becca's share entirely to Darren. The annuity company had caught an irregularity and put it on hold pending verification. I hadn't known about that either because the correspondence had been rerouted to an address I didn't recognize, the same address from Sue's change of address request. Curtis, the vanishing business partner with the good shoes, turned out to be a real person with a real record. 2 prior civil fraud cases in Kentucky. Darren knew him from somewhere, the details of which I still don't fully know and have made a decision not to obsess over. When I finally sat down with the full picture in Bill's office, I asked him a question I hadn't let myself ask out loud before. Do you think he knew what Curtis was, going in? Bill looked at me for a moment. I think that's a question for a different kind of professional than me, he said. What I decided, and I want to be precise about this, because I think precision matters when you're talking about a decision that affects your family for the rest of your life, was that I was not going to let rage make my choices. I'd seen what that looked like in other people. It ends badly, and it doesn't give you what you think it will. What I wanted was for my house to be safe, for my finances to be intact, for the fraud to be documented and addressed through proper legal channels. And yes, I wanted accountability. But I wanted the kind that leaves a record, not the kind that leaves wreckage. Bill and I worked with a litigation attorney, a specialist in financial fraud, and together we put together a package for both the lender and the annuity company. We demonstrated the document substitution through forensic analysis of the paper stock, the font inconsistencies that were invisible to the naked eye but clear under examination, and the metadata from the digital filing. We got an emergency injunction to freeze any action on the collateral while the fraud investigation was underway. The lender, when confronted with the evidence, was not interested in defending a fraudulent instrument. They had their own liability to worry about. They agreed to restructure the situation, and the fraudulent version of the document was voided. Curtis, whose real name I won't say here, became the subject of the formal fraud complaint. He had apparently pulled this same general scheme twice before, which is why the forensic accountant recognized some of the signatures in the documentation right away. Darren's role was harder to pin down legally. He had not, as far as the investigation could establish, forged anything himself. Whether he had handed documents to Curtis knowing what would happen to them, or whether he had been used as an unwitting conduit by someone who understood him better than he understood himself, was something the investigators said they could not determine with certainty. I have my own opinion about this. I keep it mostly to myself. I did speak to Darren. I did not ambush him with attorneys or police. I called him and asked him to come to the house. And when he arrived, I sat him down at my kitchen table. The same table where we'd had 1,000 meals, where his mother had helped him with homework when he was young, and I told him what I knew. All of it. I told him about the document substitution, about the change of address scheme, about the annuity. I told him that Iris had seen him taking photographs of my papers. I watched his face while I said all of it. I have thought about that face many times since. He didn't deny everything. That was the thing I hadn't expected. I think I'd prepared myself for a wall of denial, and instead what I got was something more complicated and in some ways harder. He said he'd thought the loan restructuring was just a paperwork formality that Curtis was handling. He said he hadn't known about the annuity. He said he didn't think I'd be in any real danger from it, that Curtis had told him the lender would never actually come after a residence. He said he needed the project to work. He said it was only temporary. He said he was going to tell me when things stabilized. I let him finish. Then I said, "You took pictures of my private documents in my home." He looked at the table. "You used a key I gave you for emergencies." He didn't say anything. Your mother left that money for both of you, I said. That was her life. That was 30 years of brown bag lunches and used cars and saying no to things because we were putting it away. You knew that. The thing that broke in the room right then was not dramatic. It wasn't yelling. It was just a silence that settled down over everything like a change in the air pressure. And I think we both understood that something had shifted that would not shift back. I told him that I would not be pursuing criminal charges against him specifically, given what the investigators had concluded about the limits of his provable, direct involvement. I told him that Curtis was a different matter, and that was out of my hands. I told him that the key to my house needed to come back to me before he left that day. He put it on the table between us. I told him he needed to get proper help, financial counseling, therapeutic support, whatever combination of things would actually address the pattern I'd been watching for 30 years. I told him I loved him. I told him I was deeply, profoundly disappointed in a way I wasn't sure I had the language to express. I told him that the door wasn't closed, but that it was not open in the same way it had been, and that rebuilding what had been lost was going to take a long time and could only happen on the basis of honesty. He left. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time afterward. I thought about Carolyn. I thought about the oak tree on Fielding Drive. I thought about the years I'd spent believing that the right way to love your children was to keep catching them, and whether I'd done them any favors with that belief. I don't have clean answers to that. I'm 64 years old, and I'm still working on some questions. Becca came up with the family the following weekend. Iris brought her rabbit. We had lunch, and then I took Iris out to the workshop and let her help me sand a small step stool I was making for her little brother. She is meticulous about it. She takes the sandpaper very seriously and will not cut corners, which I find encouraging. At some point, she looked up at me and said, "Is everything okay now, Grandpa?" I thought about that for a moment. "It's getting there," I said. She went back to sanding. "Good," she said, because I was worried. I looked at this 7-year-old girl with maple syrup practically a permanent feature of her wardrobe, pressing down carefully on the sandpaper, taking her job seriously. "I know you were," I said. "You kept me safe, Bug. I hope you know that." She didn't make a big thing of it. She just nodded, the way kids do when they've decided something is settled, and kept on with her work. There are people who will read this and think I was too easy on my son. I've thought about that myself. There are people who will think I was too hard. I've thought about that too. What I know is that I made the decisions that let me look at myself clearly in the mirror, that protected what Carolyn and I built together, and that left a door open rather than burning the whole house down. The step stool turned out well. I added a little carved border around the top edge, just a simple vine pattern, nothing complicated. Iris declared it the best thing I'd ever made, which is high praise from someone whose standards for woodworking are apparently quite exacting. I'll take it. I still think about the way Iris held that rabbit against her chest when she told me what she saw. Both arms wrapped around it, like she was bracing herself for whatever came next. She was 7 years old, and she had more courage in that moment than most adults I've known. That's the part that stays with me. Not the fraud, not the documents, not the hours in Bill's office going through pages I never should have had to read. What stays with me is a little girl who saw something wrong, sat with it long enough to decide it mattered, and then said it out loud anyway. Even though she knew it was about her uncle, even though she could see it was going to make things complicated for people she loved. I've thought a lot about what made her do that. She didn't calculate it. She didn't weigh the consequences. She just knew, the way children sometimes know things cleanly that adults have learned to blur, that honesty was the only right thing. That's a kind of moral clarity that doesn't come from being taught a rule. It comes from something that hasn't been worn down yet. I spent 31 years in the insurance industry watching people make choices at the edges of right and wrong. And I will tell you honestly that the clearest ethical thinking I witnessed in this whole situation came from a second grader with a stuffed rabbit. The harder reckoning, for me, has been about what I missed and for how long. The pattern with Darren didn't start with Curtis and a bridge loan. It started decades earlier, and I kept catching him, kept smoothing the runway, kept telling myself that was what love required. I was wrong about that. Not wrong to love him, I don't regret that. But wrong to confuse love with removing consequences. Every time I absorbed the landing for him, I was telling him, without meaning to, that the landing didn't have to be his to absorb. That's a lesson that compounds over years in a direction you don't want. What I understand now, and I wish I'd understood sooner, is that real steadiness, the kind that holds a family together over decades, isn't built by protecting people from the results of their own choices. It's built by being honest about what those choices are, clearly and without flinching, and then letting the consequences do the work that consequences are supposed to do. That takes something. It takes the willingness to let someone you love be uncomfortable, even when every instinct you have is saying fix it. I didn't have enough of that for long enough. I'm still working on it. There's also something I want to say about the kind of thinking it took to get through this without making it worse. When I first understood the full scope of what had happened, there was a version of me that wanted to react from the gut. Call him that night. Say all of it at once. Let the anger do the talking. I'm glad I didn't. I sat with it. I got help from people who knew more than I did. I built a complete picture before I acted, and when I did act, I acted from something more solid than rage. That deliberate patience, the willingness to slow down when everything in you wants to speed up, is something I'd undervalued most of my life. I don't undervalue it anymore. Iris kept the step stool. She uses it to reach the bathroom sink at my house when she visits. She doesn't know the full story, and she doesn't need to. What she knows is that she told me something important, and I listened, and things are okay now. That's the right amount for a 7-year-old. I'm 64. I still have questions I haven't answered. But I know this much. The people who hold the line for you aren't always the ones you expect. Sometimes they're 3.5 feet tall and they smell like maple syrup. You listen when they talk.